Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our discussion, Sustainability in the Fashion Industry. Is it scalable? My name is Hannah Cody. I'm a panel organizer for the 19th Annual Social Enterprise Conference, Capital for Good, and a second-year Master of Public Administration student here at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Many of us in the audience today have an interest in leveraging capital in order to generate solutions to the environmental and human rights challenges facing the fashion industry. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce our esteemed group of panelists who will discuss both the risks and opportunities that lie at every stage of garment production, as well as what a sustainable future for fashion may look like given the global COVID-19 pandemic. First, I'd like to welcome Asha Sheikh Deerwester, Chief Strategy and Partnerships Officer at Nest, an organization that seeks to build a new handworker economy to increase global workforce inclusivity, improve women's well-being beyond factories, and preserve important cultural traditions around the world. Asha leads Nest's global and domestic partnerships and revenue generation strategies and served an integral role in the launch of Nest's Seal of Ethical Handcraft, part of an industry-wide initiative to bring ethical compliance training, assessment, and remediation to the informal sector. Next, I'd like to introduce Mallory McConnell, Senior Director of Supplier Sustainability and Partnerships at PVH, one of the largest global apparel companies that is home to brands like Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. Mallory is responsible for leading, managing, and driving progress against all forward fashion supply chain targets and programs, and has a keen eye on how organizations like PVH can execute human rights and environmental sustainability supply chain programs across global contexts. Anushka Salinas joins us as the President and Chief Operating Officer of Rent the Runway, as well as an alumna of the Columbia Business School. As a brand that has truly reinvented what the modern closet looks like today, Anushka brings a deep understanding of Rent the Runway's unique approach to tackling major sustainability challenges like overconsumption by leveraging the sharing economy. Last, but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Jessica Schreiber. She is an alumna of the Columbia Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and founder and CEO of FabScrap, a local organization that provides convenient pickup and recycling of fabric scraps from businesses in New York City and creates opportunities for reuse. By addressing the issue of commercial textile waste, FabScrap is bringing much needed innovative solutions to mitigate the impacts at the end of the textile life cycle. Our panel today will be moderated by Rachel Cernansky, Sustainability Editor at Vogue Business, and another alumna of the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Rachel brings with her a wealth of knowledge on issues ranging from toxic chemicals in apparel manufacturing to circular business models and fashion's role in global biodiversity loss. So we're very honored to have her with us to guide today's discussion. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Rachel to begin our panel.
Hi, thanks, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to have this conversation with such leaders in this space. So let's get started. So let's see. So the majority of those who work in the fashion industry are women, as this panel and demonstrates, and as we all tend to know. But the extensiveness of supply chains that lack women's representation at higher levels of decision making can make it difficult to achieve meaningful, uniform progress on sustainability and human rights. How can organizations work with suppliers and workers across global supply chains to ensure that socially and environmentally responsible practices reach everyone, especially women? And I would love for the panel to address how to do that at different levels of scale, because it's one thing for a small company to try to work on something, but then does that sort of trickle up to larger organizations? So Asha, let's start with you for that.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I'm with Nest, as shared earlier, and we work with the population of producers that exist outside of the four-wall factory in homes and small workshops all over the world. And the majority of the population that we work with is women. And as we think about what is really important in terms of supporting women within the supply chain, it's really rethinking what work looks like and what type of work structures enable and support women. And it's something that we are all considering now as we rethink the future of work and what work looks like for each and every one of us. And homework is a really incredibly powerful tool for women. It provides, in places where there is high gender discrimination and unsafe working conditions or unsafe abilities to actually travel to work, which is what we're seeing currently right now in light of the COVID pandemic, an opportunity for them to earn an income while remaining at home to care for children and other dependents. And that is something that now more than ever, every single one of us can resonate with and can understand and respect and appreciate. And it's really important to also think about the misconceptions around homeworking and these small production mechanisms and systems. One of the most common misconceptions of the space that we work within is that it is small, non-scalable, niche, and localized. But in reality, the space that we work within, the artisan and craft space, is a $500 billion industry, and it includes millions of workers, primarily women. One of the key things that companies can really do in terms of supporting women within their supply chain is think about what type of policies they have in place and how are those enabling or disabling women's inclusion within the supply chain. So things like homeworking policies, subcontracting policies, and rather than emphasizing the risk associated with that, really considering where are there opportunities to help elevate women, and where are there opportunities to utilize these policies to include women. And so another thing that companies can really think about is what tools exist within the industry. As mentioned by Hannah in the introduction, Nest has created and launched the Seal of Ethical Handcraft at the United Nations alongside industry partners, including PVH, Patagonia, West Elm, Target, Eileen Fisher, and many others. It is an incredible tool that is universally applicable across countries and across craft types. And tools like that really help get down to compliance at the end worker level. Alongside that tool, one of the things that Nest has developed is a worker well-being tool for actually assessing what are the impacts of being able to work from home, particularly for women. And some of the incredible data points that are coming out from that worker well-being tool is finding that women who are able and given the opportunity to work from home have actually are able to breastfeed for longer is one example because they are at home. There's also increased power, sense of agency, and decision-making ability that these women have because they are able to contribute to the income for the household and the family.
I'd love to jump in and give kind of the Rent the Runway point of view on this next, kind of keying off of some of the points that you made, Asha. I think we certainly believe as a larger scale business that across the board business leaders have a moral obligation to create positive change in the communities that they build. And we knew that kind of the place that we could start doing that, especially with as large as an employee base as we have today, was looking kind of internally at ourselves. And, you know, historically, the company's 11 plus years old now, and we sort of modeled our benefits structures off of those around us in the startup community, larger companies, aspirationally. And we started to realize over the last several years that actually the benefit structure that we had was really fundamentally flawed. And so in early 2018, we made a shift to equalize benefits across all employee types. So our customer service employees, our warehouse employees, of which outnumber our corporate employees multiples to one, as you could probably imagine, you know, we started to realize, why is it that someone that is, just because they're paid hourly, but they've been with us for several years, not getting the same maternity benefits as an example, or bereavement leave that a corporate employee gets? Certainly the burden on that person is just as great, if not greater. So we made that move in 2018. And I think the stance that we've taken is that, you know, while these types of moves are costly in the short term, they're the right things to do in the medium to long term for the business, actually, not even just for the people that we employ. Of course, it's the right thing for the people we employ on the near term, but in the medium to long term, it helps with employee retention, it helps with customer retention, and really helps drive more sustainable businesses. I think the second piece that we've seen much more recently is, because of COVID and the pandemic sort of forcing as many people to work from home as possible, our customer service team, which was always co-located in our warehouse location, so it was always, you had to come in to do your job. We moved to a fully remote model where we had been gun shy to do it before. And what we've seen is a fundamental shift in ease of recruitment. That was traditionally a very hard place for us to recruit talent. We traditionally got kind of a postgraduate sort of younger employee base that turned over very quickly and had low job satisfaction. We've now seen that we're able to attract a slightly older, generally working mom, getting back into the workforce type of employee. Their satisfaction with us is extremely high versus where it's been in the past. And we're seeing much stronger retention and quality as well. So the early studies that we're seeing, not just on the corporate side, but also kind of in our customer service side, has been really positive, sort of to your point, around working from home and the benefits for women.
Mallory, did you want to add anything to that on,
Yeah, I was going to say I can jump in kind of from a more traditional supply chain perspective. So, I think echoing everything you guys have said, when we look at women's advancement and women's empowerment in the supply chain, there's definitely a lot of work to do in this space, right? And so, I want to say women make up anywhere between 75 to 80% of our workforce in the supply chain. So that's huge, right? And when you start to look at that number, that's really at the sort of operator entry level position within the factory. Then when you start to look at supervisor levels or manager levels, that number decreases significantly. So when we've thought about this, we've kind of gone to say, how do we start to address this at like kind of a systemic root cause level that then allows us to see those progressions improve over time? And really, we've looked at this through the lens of training and development, and really life skill and soft skill training for women in the supply chain. So, what we hope and what we've seen is that when we start to empower people and give them education around how to manage issues or how to manage tough conversations with their supervisors, how to, sometimes even ask for time off, financial literacy. We see that this leads to dramatic improvements in terms of professional growth and ability to kind of grow into those next levels and positions. So, I think we kind of double down on that sort of training and capability building piece that hopefully allows us to sort of generate the skills needed for women to then progress and advance within the sort of traditional factory scene.
Great. Thanks everyone for those thoughts. Let's move on to the current situation we're in with COVID, which has led to disruptions for all industries, including fashion. Fashion's had enormous impacts. Can you talk about how that has impacted your sustainability initiatives and the challenges or opportunities you see for sustaining responsible business practices in the industry's post-pandemic reality? Jessica, maybe let's start with you there.
Sure, yeah. Being sort of at fashion's end of life, we're working with about 500 brands now to pick up their excess material. And that could be rolls of fabric, swatch cards, unwanted merchandise in some cases. I think initially the hard part was that everybody sort of stopped working for a moment. And even in that, waste didn't stop. Even while we weren't working, there were still requests for pickup, and there were still inquiries about where can I send this waste? I feel guilty about sending it to landfill. And so even though COVID kind of put all things in terms of like a workforce and organization on hold, physically the material was still moving and work was still happening. And I think for me working in end of life, it was just another reminder that the waste just never ends. And there's a reason that we're all working towards solutions. I think the next sort of moment where I realized the impact of COVID was as businesses started to reopen. There were several that reopened only because they needed us to pick up everything because they had closed. And it's been really sad to see some of our long-term smaller New York-based brands have to end their operations. On the flip side, there is sort of a regenesis there of, because they're making the sustainable choice, even at the end of their life, they, in some cases, were sending us 1,500 rolls of fabric that now can be redistributed and reused and recycled and are becoming a resource for fashion students, for the fashion industry, for new designers to create more sustainably and have some sort of point of education around textile waste. So I think that decision has been great. And then lastly, I think the hard part for us is always changing the verb, even though we're a nonprofit, from donate to recycle. So much of what we get is not reusable and needs to be recycled. And we're really trying to work with brands to have them understand that the way that they pay for trash pickup or paper recycling, textile recycling needs that same sort of private financial support. And so I think the hardest thing too has been, as everybody's sort of crunching numbers, the first thing they ask is like, well, can I just donate this to you? Can you just take all of my waste for free? And so we're still working within budgets in a tighter way now to make sure that brands have this service, but also that they are supporting the infrastructure for this service to exist.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I can jump in, I think, from, sorry, Nisha, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I could just briefly jump in, I think, from a PVH perspective. So, I mean, I think like everyone else, it's been a sort of unprecedented time for both our business as well as for our supply chain. And so, you know, when we think about our sort of commitment to our social environmental programs, really proud to say that I think we've doubled down here and found that this is like more important than ever during this time to continue to progress and invest in these programs. I think at the end of the day, it really speaks to the idea that like our values as an organization are non-negotiable, right? And so, you know, we believe in these causes and we will, you know, continue to support them through hard times and not. You know, I would say maybe two things I'll kind of call out here that I think we're particularly excited about or proud of in terms of work during this time. So, you know, one, I think as we started to see this progress out in the supply chain and see either, you know, regions close or people struggle financially, really looking at how do we start to support and educate our suppliers through that time. So I think, you know, one piece was really thinking about how do we guide our factories and suppliers through guidance around safe work and returns to work and really relying on the WHO guidelines there, but making sure that education got out into the supply chain and that everyone's kind of aware of how to act in a responsible business way during this time. You know, I think the second piece was, you know, as you look at factory closures, that people either being permanently or temporarily out of work in countries, you know, there's a real challenge in regions where there aren't social protections in place from a governmental perspective for workers. And so, you know, there was recently something that we were a huge part of, which was the ILO call to action to the International Labour Organization, along with other brands and donor organizations, really looked at how do we come together as an industry to create social protections for workers and make sure that, you know, during this time, if people are out of work or laid off, that's not going to sort of result in mass poverty and ultimately, you know, all of the detrimental impacts that come from that. So I'll maybe stop there, but happy to answer any questions on that.
Yeah, thank you. It's I think each one of these questions could be a 2-hour-long conversation in itself. So so we can move on, but thank you for that. Let's talk about metrics. Metrics are critical for tracking progress toward ESG and CSR goals. And so can you talk about how your organizations approach the challenge of measuring your sustainability and human rights impacts? And if you could touch specifically on you know, not just measuring the progress, but also how to evaluate kind of progress against the end goal. How do you know, how far along you are compared to where you need to be, rather than just how much, you know, less bad, basically, things are getting. So Mallory, maybe let's start with you for that.
Sure, thanks. So metrics are a really important part of our program, and it's been something that we've been evolving over time. So in 2019, we announced a new corporate responsibility strategy at PVH called Forward Fashion. And one of the most exciting aspects of Forward Fashion is that it includes 15 targets aimed to deepen our level of ambition, really to keep us accountable and to ensure confidence in our approach. So we grounded these priorities in areas where we have the greatest impact, and we set targets that are really specific, they're measurable, they're time-bound. Internally, this gives us kind of a shared roadmap and a clear objective to work towards. I think externally, they represent action-oriented leadership, which we're really proud of. We, like any large business, I think, face complex challenges. Ensuring our business is responsible and sustainable, and sort of Forward Fashion really acts as our commitment to make sure that we're getting it right as an organization. So what I've grown to appreciate about our evolving approach to metrics and reporting is that we're now committed to highlighting not only our successes from the past year, but really our opportunities for improvement in an effort to drive progress towards transparency. So we continue to evolve our approach to reporting and metrics, and we're really measuring against metrics set by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB as people know them, and then again aligning our strategy with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But again, we truly believe that transparency drives accountability, and are getting really comfortable with being humble and honest about where we're seeing really good progress and where we need to accelerate improvement. So I'll stop there and see if anyone else wants to chime in.
Great. Asha?
Yeah, I can jump in. So Mallory, I really appreciate that that framework of transparency drives accountability. That is so true. And I think that there, on the Nest side, there really is, when there's like a willingness to kind of start peeling back the layers of a supply chain and have that level of transparency, then you really can start looking at metrics and improvement, and most importantly, impact and what that impact looks like. The Nest Seal and compliance program in of itself is kind of a metrics tracker. It's built out of a matrix of 150 different standards across the key kind of categories of compliance that you'll see within the traditional factory and supply chain. And the worker well-being tool that I had mentioned that was developed based off a variety of different internationally accepted and adopted mechanisms and tools is implemented at the start of every supply chain compliance program we work with, midway through a program, and every time during assessment and reassessment. And so being able to track metrics utilizing that tool has been really powerful, because we're able to see change over time and be able to see, exactly to your point, the Nest Seal of Ethical Handcraft being the gold standard, and how are we having a continuous improvement approach to that standard over time. And then on a nonprofit level, and just kind of thinking about the question around COVID, which I know we're all like eager to answer because it's what we've been living and breathing over the last 6 months, is just that also being able to track data in a timely and consistent manner allows us to be able to respond to the immediate and urgent needs of our beneficiaries as an organization. And so because we had those metrics capture tools in place, when COVID hit, Nest was able to rapidly respond and see what the needs were for these individual workers, who was at risk of losing their jobs, of these businesses closing. And we were able to, within a span of 90 days, rally enough funds and resources to be able to rapidly respond through product financing and purchases, through relief grants, and through a Mask by Makers program, which was issued out and actually provided 250,000 masks to healthcare workers and community organizations across 18 different countries. And really, we would not have been able to do all of that work and do it quickly without having the data. And just on the last point of data is that it was really incredible that within the first few months of COVID, we were able to save 4,000 artisan jobs because of all those relief efforts, which is something we could all be really proud of.
That's amazing. Okay, thank you. I love this panel because everyone represents such a different facet of the industry. So, so on that note, Anushka, let's talk about your kind of business model a little bit. What is your business argument for integrating sustainability and human rights into the fashion industry? And where are the major gaps or barriers, including funding, when it comes to advancing these ESG goals?
Yeah, I think, you hit the nail on the head, which is the business that we embarked on 11 years ago was, inherently aiming to be a more sustainable model of consumption for the future for fashion, utilizing pieces of inventory over and over and over again, in particular, the types of styles and inventory that would generally only be worn once or twice before being put into a landfill, or now hopefully, given to fab scrap, but we know that's not all the time. So I think that's the way we started, and certainly have evolved the business model to include a subscription program, which has taken our impact from a few times a year to many, many days of the month, sometimes every single day of the month, thereby allowing us to really extend the life cycle of garments, which is a key metric that we look at internally, is extension of the life of a garment. So this has been at the forefront of our thinking as a business since the very beginning. Interestingly, even when we embarked on subscription, we thought that sustainability would be a key value proposition for our customers right at the beginning in 2016 when we embarked on this. And we do a lot of testing and surveying with our customers. And interestingly, at the beginning of subscription, we did not see that in the top 3 value propositions or sort of reasons for sign up that sustainability was really hitting. And what we've seen in the last 12 months is more than doubling of the percentage of customers that tell us that the primary reason that they're coming and signing up for a subscription to fashion is sustainability. So I think that's really illustrative of the change across the board, certainly in the US, and how top of mind environmental sustainability is. Certainly also, affiliation with brands that they think they share values with is super critical. We see that in all of the studies and statistics that, Gen Z and millennials really, really care enough that they're willing to spend more money on businesses where they have kind of aligned business value, moral values with that company. So we've seen, to me, the business argument is the customer argument. It's one that we've been, talking the talk and walking the walk on for many years, but we're really seeing sort of consumers come around and put that at the forefront of what matters to them. And we've sort of doubled down during the period of COVID, to just speak about that for a second, on the circular economy. We believe more than ever in this period of time and coming out of COVID that customers are going to care more and more about this, regardless of what the administration at the time happens to say. I think customers care, and we're seeing that. And so we've sort of restructured our subscription programs with sustainability in mind to reduce shipments, but still deliver the same amount of value. We've doubled down on things like reusable packaging, things like drop-off boxes, which we started back in 2018 and 19, which really help reduce help customers be the last mile and sort of reduce the amount of single parcel packages that are being delivered. So all of that is to say we're investing more during this time because we think it matters more than ever coming out of COVID for the business as well. And so we've commissioned a suite of studies to help us really better measure kind of what our impact is, and sort of keying off of what everyone said. And I love hearing the resounding consistency on this panel. Transparency is, we believe, super important. And for us uniquely, what that means is, consumers don't have a lot of access or understanding necessarily to the choices that they make and what that means for the environment today. And so our goal, once we sort of wrap up some of these studies, is in 2021 to be able to share much more transparently what the impacts of the choices customers can make on our platform are, whether that's choosing to rent something one time, whether that's choosing to purchase it from us via our resale capabilities, really sort of allowing customers to have all the information and make the choices that make the most sense for them.
Great. Thank you. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to move to the next question, although I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts on that. But so let's talk about extended producer responsibility, EPR, which for those who are not familiar is basically a concept trying to address companies' role in managing what happens to their products and the impacts of their products after they have, at the end of their lives, once they've been in the consumer's hands. Jessica, let's have you talk about this. Can you talk about how you are tackling the idea of EPR, and then if we could get a quick kind of 20-second or something run through of the panel of how each of your organizations are sort of grappling with this concept. I think we'd love to hear about that before we move to the Q&A.
Sure. EPR is one of my favorite topics. It's actually what I did my final paper at Columbia on. Thinking through sort of end of life and my obsession with trash, it became really apparent working in government and also being a consumer that whether or not something could be recycled is a design decision. In most cases, there could be recyclable components, but if they're not easily deconstructible, then the whole thing is not recyclable. And so there's so much about what happens end of life that I wish could be informed and taken into account at the point of design. And so EPR really makes that possible in a way where whether or not something is disposable or recyclable, it's a policy that would hold the producer more accountable for that. And there's a couple different ways to do that. The best versions of that are not a tax, where it's a tax on the consumer, again, to help create these recycling programs, but take back models or tax rebates for the companies that have take back models or have more recyclable components, really working with the producers themselves so that there's a change in the design behavior as opposed to taxes, end of lives, or credits or fines. So there's really a lot of different ways to model it. And what's exciting is that this already exists for so many different product categories. In 2015, New York State passed it for electronics. I was at the city at the time. Before that policy was passed, 300 buildings had New York City's electronic recycling program. That policy was passed, and overnight we had 3,000 applications for buildings to enroll in that program. So it's also just a really powerful motivator and tool for governments and for consumers to bring an industry into end of life and see real movement towards a more sustainable and circular option. And it's exciting to think about if a designer or a product was going back to its source and they were responsible for deconstructing it, how immediately would that design change? And how immediately would they think about the components and what's recyclable and what could be reused? And so this exists already in France for textiles. And so I think it's coming. And that's something that even in launching FabScrap and kind of talking through with brands, like the value prop of using FabScrap is that at some point, I think there will be some accountability for waste streams, and starting to think about your recycling systems now and your material components now is a way to get ahead of that and be more involved and actually proactive in a way where if you're a leader here, you could be informing the policy and not just subject to whatever is being passed.
Great. Okay. I don't know if we have time. Maybe Mallory, is this something that that you guys are addressing, or should we just move to the Q&A?
No, I'm happy to chime in here. I mean, I think I'll look at it from less of a sort of traditional EPR perspective, but just on the, what I think is a true business opportunity around circularity, right? I think as you kind of move into new eras, you start to, like, there's a real business value to thinking through how do we get our products back and either resell them, refurbish them, or recycle them into new product, right? Like this idea of transitioning from waste as waste as an asset is one that's really interesting. I think there's just inherently large challenges around it, right? We've built supply chains that are really efficient at getting products to consumers. We've not built supply chains that are really efficient at getting products back from consumers. So I think it's something that everyone's thinking about, working on, that people see really huge, not just sustainability opportunity, but business value in. And so really looking forward to it in terms of what kind of comes out of this in the next, 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. I think Hannah's going to take over from here.
Yes, thank you all so much. And I feel like I have a million questions, and I think that our audience members certainly do too. So really excited to dive in. Just a friendly reminder to our participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And if you don't necessarily have a question on top of mind, feel free to scroll through and upvote ones that resonate with you. And this will help us prioritize making sure that we're answering the questions that really are most interesting to our audience. So I'll start out then with this question that talks about the issue of complexity with supply chains, and how, when you're looking especially at global supply chains where maybe there are either transparency issues or you're looking at multiple countries, how do you really integrate sustainability into models like that when you're juggling a lot of balls? So maybe that's a question Mallory, if you'd like to start, then we can open up.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess just to give you guys maybe a high level overview. So, we obviously operate a pretty complex supply chain. I want to say we operate in over 52 different countries, and that's just production countries, not retail countries. And it's definitely a challenge that we face. And I would say the first is really setting up kind of platforms of expectations and then kind of measuring against those in a standardized kind of global way. I think then thinking through how do we really focus on improvement and sort of capability building and continue to engage with our manufacturers to ensure that, human rights are non-negotiable and that, we're really starting to see the level of environmental performance that we need. I think that's really on a sort of supplier stance. I think the next level of work that we're really trying to do is, how do we take the data that we're getting out of our programs and our industry peers as well, and start translating that into conversations at levels that really affect sort of systemic change, right? So how are we using our data to then go out and talk to regulators in country or other sort of tripartite organizations that are important to us, and really have conversations so that we can systemically solve some of these challenges and issues.
I'd love to jump in here and just add to a little bit of that. I think one of the key things, given how complex the supply chains are, and just even seeing some of the Q&A questions around raw materials, is really kind of the first, and it's two words, but it's very, very complicated, is supply mapping and supply chain mapping. And it's really a key first step in trying to figure out what are the policies and processes that need to be put in place to be applicable for each level and layer of the supply chain. And then I would just say second to that, what is really critical is the capacity building that Mallory mentioned, and being able to, once those policies and expectations are created and the supply chain is mapped, which is a huge undertaking in itself, is how is that information then being disseminated to each layer and level of the supply chain. And that's a really critical component, because policies can be posted on a website, they can be internalized within a company, but how are they actually getting into the hands of each level and layer of the supply chain?
Absolutely. Yeah. And definitely part of the accessibility part, not only for consumers, but for those who are employed within supply chains. So thanks for bringing that up. Next, and I think that Jessica, you touched on this a little bit already, but we can dive a little bit more into the role of government regulation. And would love to hear your opinions on where you think government role is in promoting sustainability in the fashion industry versus market-driven approaches.
I am happy to kind of start, though I think my last answer is pretty much how I feel about government involvement. And I think that there's a way that this could work with it being market driven, but I think it's really hard for there to be accountability across the board without some sort of standards of what that means, or at least some sort of reporting. And so that's where I feel like a neutral third party is really helpful, instead of brands reporting to themselves. And maybe that looks more like a public-private partnership with other orgs as opposed to government. But I do think having some regulations that are to the benefit of all, and kind of like rising tides raise all ships, is that immediately everyone has to meet these, not just the people who are already doing it well. I think that really can go a long way. And I also think that there's different ways to fund this when government is involved, that make it more appealing to businesses to comply, or make it really hard for them to not comply. And so I think that there's just I do think it takes three different parts there to kind of pull the right levers to make something successful, both in its intention and in its implementation.
Can I jump in there? As the moderator, even though I'm not a panelist, this exact question was the focus of my story that published yesterday. So it's top of mind for me. So I just want to run through quickly just some of the things that came up. And it seems, and I did the story because in so much of my reporting, the barrier to further progress beyond what is already happening is the lack of policy. And it's because of either because businesses can't afford to compete with companies that don't have the same bar, like it's not an even playing field basically, or just because the supply chain won't sort of transform itself. And so there were policies that came up with regard to agriculture, like the Farm Bill, even the Farm Bill, with how this is US focused, but how like the Farm Bill right now focuses on what farmers grow, but not on how they grow it. And then how you grow a crop has a huge, just fundamental impact on if you contribute an enormous amount of environmental impacts, or if you can even start sequestering carbon in how you grow a crop. So there were some suggestions around the Farm Bill, and if there's a climate bill, include agriculture in it. But then also things like there were some suggestions that didn't make it in about like a public fund for studying the health impacts of microfibers at the end of life, and some way to sort of track that kind of pollution to the producers who are using those materials, and sort of connecting, building the responsibility in there, or putting a tax on synthetic materials so that then that sort of creates that fund. And chemicals are used in textiles that, and there's no regulation around what, is public. So there were some suggestions around disclosure requirements for saying what exactly is in material, and letting the consumer either know that, and then potentially having ripple effects on the use of those chemicals. There were a bunch of others, but I just wanted to throw some of those out there because that's a key question.
Did you want to jump in, Anushka?
Oh, no, I was just looking at the next question that might be coming up, and I have a really obvious response.
Perfect. Yeah, so let's just then jump right into the next question, which I think is the $1 million question that I know I get a lot, which is around affordability and how do we make sustainable fashion more economically accessible to more consumers.
Yeah, and my answer is the obvious one, which is there's many pieces to kind of the journey of operating your life in a more sustainable way. And I think, something that resonates with us a lot is that 80% of a woman's closet is worn 3 times or less. So even if you had purchased an organic cotton t-shirt instead of a regular t-shirt, which is the right choice and everyone should do that, if it's not something that you're going to wear a lot and get a lot of usage out of, fundamentally, it's not necessarily a more sustainable choice. And that's obviously the bedrock of our business, is really helping to drive better utilization, less ownership of things that you don't really need to own. That's not to say that there's not a portion of one's closet that you should own. Certainly the jeans that you're going to wear very often and the sweaters that you're going to wear very often and things like that make a ton of sense, because you'll probably wear them 20 times or more. But really offerings like Rent the Runway, offerings like ThredUp and The RealReal that are helping to, ensure that garments and accessories are not just getting used a few times or not at all and thrown into a landfill, are very affordable choices in kind of ways to get dressed. So I think all the new business models, of which Rent the Runway is one, is really helping to drive kind of value and sustainability at the same time.
I can maybe jump in, I think, just from a sort of, again, more traditional brand perspective. I think a lot of this comes to scalability and adoption, right? And, when we think about the constant conversations of, organic cotton's more expensive, or it's not as widely as available, or recycled poly, or there's not processes to kind of decouple and recycle. All of those are very fixable problems, right? And it's just about scale and adoption. And so, I think as we start to see bigger demand, I think that affordability question starts to solve itself. To just my kind of 2 cents on that one.
Great. Thanks so much, Mallory. So I think we have time for one last question from the Q&A before I pass it over to Rachel to ask our final question. I'm going to ask one. It's directed toward Jessica, but I think I'm going to try to expand it a little bit to get all of your opinions if possible. It's talking about how do we shift a non-mission driven company's perception of value in order to invest in services like Fab Scrap. And I think I would love to expand that to also offer if any of the rest of you would also like to jump in on just how do you use your position to bring in other businesses, whether they're in your industry or within your supply chain, to invest in human rights, sustainability, or other really mission-driven programs. So open that up to all of you.
I think the easiest way that I can answer that is like knowing why some brands have signed up to work with Fab Scrap. I think designers are so trained and so specialized and so busy at what they're already supposed to be doing in their work that to also add sustainability and worrying about all of those metrics and that waste is like basically another full-time job. And there are great companies that have sustainability teams, but a lot don't. And so it's sort of an afterthought. And so the value, I think, where we find it is that we'll take everything and we'll figure out where it goes and what the highest end possible use is and how to redistribute it and do that anonymously for you if you like, so that you can continue doing the work that you were trained and meant to do while educating on, well, we can't recycle spandex. So knowing that, would that change the way that you design, or knowing where we're at with certain recycling technologies? So the first, I think, is just taking that burden of educating themselves on all of the possible things. And so I think there's a huge case to be made for third-party partnerships there, and cross-collaboration. Like, my background is not fashion, it's waste management, but fashion needs waste management and fashion needs engineers and reverse logistics. And I think there's a lot of cross-collaboration there. The other thing is going back to, like everybody said, the data and the transparency. And across the board, commercial waste is not something that we have a lot of transparency on, really, in any industry. And so that Fab Scrap is not just providing this service that can be sort of validated in where all of the material is going, but then also giving as much information as possible back to the brand so that we can say how much was reused, recycled, what went to landfill and why, and convert that into CO2 savings for them, trees planted equivalent for them. And so I think that's where there's real value in sort of these third-party partnerships. And I think as much as brands understand paying for the service, you're not going to get a report from landfill about how much you sent to landfill and its impact, but you will working with companies like Fab Scrap.
I don't have much to say except wholeheartedly agree. I think the third-party partnerships and collaborations are really, really the key. And exactly to what Jessica shared is that it's a lot of education and creation and design and development, which is just difficult to find the bandwidth and space to do it. And is it really even necessary when there are third parties or other experts out there within the sector and space that you can collaborate with, so that you don't have to design a supply chain mapping tool, so that you don't have to rely on your auditing firms who are very used to working with factory spaces to be able to apply those same standards outside of factories. So collaboration and third party support is really critical.
Great, thank you all so much. Rachel, would you like to ask our final question and close this out?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. And thanks for those great questions, everyone. So let's talk about, politics are kind of on everyone's mind right now. So in the lead up to the recent election, it seemed like the fall fashion trend was vote. There were just vote t-shirts and handbags and accessories everywhere. What do you all see as the fashion industry's role in driving social impact and activism among consumers and communities more broadly? And specifically, how does that role sort of mesh with not driving, continued overconsumption and overproduction? Who wants to start with that simple question? Jessica, Asha, Anushka. Should I take it? Anushka, let's go with you.
Yeah, and sorry, you wanted to hear about how the incoming administration will impact our.
What fashion's role is in driving social change and how to have that role without, selling more Vote t-shirts constantly or more overconsumption.
Yeah, I think, fashion's role is certainly to be more thoughtful. I think evolution of business models is a big way that we're going to see that over the course of the next several years. I think, one thing that we really believe in is that businesses need to sort of act in a way that's authentic to the heart of what the business really does. And I think like what we saw over the last 8 or 9 months, and I'm sure everyone was sort of watching, is brands sort of playing around with getting involved in conversations where sometimes it was really deeply and authentically meaningful to what the brand stands for and things they were willing to act on, and sometimes not. And I think it was very clear when a brand was acting from a place of kind of something really genuine versus not. And the example that I use there is certainly kind of during the summer when there was a lot of heat and thought around social justice. And we certainly saw brands sort of get into the conversation that maybe didn't have a lot to say, and brands that did. And for us, we were thoughtful about what really mattered to us and what we felt like was going to matter to our customers. And for us, that meant making sure that we had an assortment and representation of designers on our site that was reflective of kind of the broader community that we serve in the United States. So our way of sort of getting into the conversation and participating was committing to the Aurora James 15% pledge, and sort of signing up to spend an additional $1 million to support Black designers through kind of our wholesale and platform initiatives. So I think authenticity is really important in kind of acting on the things that matter to a brand and matter to the end consumer of that brand.
Yeah, and I'll maybe piggyback off that because I think that, it's definitely been an interesting year, I think, and for everyone in business as well. And, I think it's been very interesting about, how businesses are now being asked to take stances or opinions on issues that we traditionally haven't been, right? And I think, some of that has led to really interesting conversations internally. I think it's prompted sort of an internal review and sometimes come out with like really important changes for us internally in the business. I also think about sometimes the opportunity that industry has to step up where governments haven't, right? And so if you think about, something that comes to my mind is sort of the fashion industry's response to the U.S. dropping out of the Paris Accord, right? And so, I think there is an opportunity as well for business to kind of take the reins in spaces where we see leadership lacking.
I think to answer that, I'll steal from something that Anushka said earlier, which is that the business argument is the consumer argument, and just really that consumers have such an incredibly powerful role to play here, to hold the industry's feet to the fire. And really, I think that's what we've seen in the last few months is the power of consumers and their voice to actually create change at a high level within the organization and within the industry. And so for consumers to kind of keep fighting the good fight and keep vocalizing these opinions really helps make sustainable change on a government policy level and an industry level and a corporate level.
Gosh, I feel like that is the perfect way to end this panel and leave everyone feeling very excited about, yes, keeping feet to the fire and making sure that we're doing our part in driving progress. So thank you all so much for joining us today. This was an excellent discussion that, again, could go on for hours, but maybe for next time, part 2. So at this point, I will pass it over and encourage our participants to stick around for our closing remarks, which will be delivered by Professor Bruce Usher. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate the introduction, and thanks to everybody for a great set of panels today. I really want to thank our speakers, our volunteers, our co-chairs, our center faculty and staff, and of course, and most importantly, all of you for joining us online today. It's through these efforts that we're here today to execute on one part of the Tamer Center's mission to educate leaders to address pressing social and environmental challenges. In fulfilling this mission, the conference digital event series is a hallmark of the center's goal to create a space for the innovation and exchange of new ideas across campus. It was an inspiring morning hearing from our speakers about the unique and innovative ways in which they're deploying capital to have environmental and social impact in our society. Whether you're part of a nonprofit, a philanthropy, a social venture, or a for-profit business, we all have a responsibility to invest in the future. We hope that you will continue to join us for these important conversations. The entire series will showcase the wide range of possibilities available across sectors to have social and environmental impact. And throughout the series, we expect to cover topics ranging from racial equity to ESG and impact investing, sustainable fashion and food systems, renewable energy, journalism, equitable and inclusive housing, healthcare, and more. We hope this conference has highlighted the various opportunities available for you to use capital for good, and we look forward to seeing you online in the future. Again, thank you.